Hello, everybody. I'm Martin DeCaro, and I host History as It Happens podcast here at the Washington Times. With us today, Michael Kimmage, historian, Catholic University. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin.
And the purpose of this conversation is Ukraine war update. But first, a note about your upcoming book about the same subject, about the origins of the war. The title is Collisions. It's coming out next March, right?
Exactly right. Oxford University Press, March 2024.
It's a challenge to write about a war while it's going on, I assume.
It is, but the topic is the origins of the war.
Yeah.
So, that's a little bit more back in time and
Yeah.
not so much affected by the outcome.
Contested origins, of course. And the reason you're here today, you've been writing a series of widely read articles for Foreign Affairs, almost journalism. You're a historian, but you've been doing journalism of a kind. Every few weeks, writing another essay about the status of the war between Russia and Ukraine. That must be challenging as well.
Well, merely history as it happens, Martin.
That's right. You stole my line. I was about to mention that. So the war, is it a stalemate?
I think that's probably not the perfect word because there's a fair amount of active fighting. I think everybody on the Ukrainian side is concerned about massive attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure this winter. There's been a little bit of movement around a village town of Avdiivka in the last couple of weeks, and the maritime war is also ongoing, maybe not so much in the last month or two, but certainly within the last couple of months. So yes, the line of contact is not moving much, but there's still a lot of kinetic activity on both sides, and I don't think it will be an especially quiet winter for Ukraine. So both armies have, to a degree, ground to a halt, but still not quite a stalemate.
Russia hasn't won any major victory since the summer of 2022, correct?
Well, I mean, you could say that Russia conquered the city of Bakhmut, which is true. It's a city of 70,000 on which enormous amounts of manpower and materiel were expended. And that was a prestige set-piece battle for Putin. Doesn't really change much about the war, but that is a kind of Russian victory that was, I think, May of this past year.
Was it strategically important?
As far as I can tell, it was not. Well,
the point being that the front lines haven't really moved very much, and neither side can really point to any type of major victory. Well, they will.
That's absolutely correct.
That's war. You have to win the propaganda battle as well. But the Ukrainian counteroffensive, it looked like it failed. But how was it supposed to succeed without air support, air supremacy? NATO doesn't fight wars without air supremacy. The United States doesn't fight wars without air supremacy. So maybe there was some misguided optimism there about the decisive battle, the myth of the decisive battle.
Certainly there was that. I think that as it comes into focus for me, at least, there were two rival timelines with the counteroffensive. And I think on the Ukrainian side, what they looked at was a certain manpower exhaustion and the enormous difficulty, as you're suggesting, about the battle space, which is full of drones, which the Russians did a good job of defending in their terms, and over which Ukraine, as you say, didn't have air superiority. So I think that what the high command in Kiev felt was that they needed to guard jealously the number of troops that they were going to expend, keep their reserves, it's a long war, and make this just one episode among many. I think on the Western side, and in a sense, both sides are analytically correct. On the Western side, what was acknowledged, maybe not publicly as much as it should have been, is that there are lots of limits to how much aid can be given to Ukraine. And some of those are logistical, that the West is kind of running out of stuff and it's been slow to reproduce. And some of that is political, as we're seeing play out before our eyes on Capitol Hill and also in Brussels at the European Union. So I think on the West, there was a kind of grudging acknowledgement, like this is the highest pitch of support for Ukraine, so go for it. While you've got all of the support on the Ukrainian side, there was a reluctance to make a big move given some of the Russian strength. So it's not that either of these arguments was wrong, it's that they both amount to sort of a difference of opinion on the one hand and fairly moderate gains on the ground on the other.
It's a very tricky and thorny situation because one of the combatants is almost entirely reliant on outside powers for its war effort, really for its budget. Ukraine's federal budget, about half of it is funded by outside help, and all of its ammunition, for instance, has to come from the United States and Europe. It's heavy weaponry, the anti-tank missiles, etc. And, the great military historian Cathal Nolan has told me, in wars of attrition, which I think this is, And in wars of attrition, you have one side that's much more it's stronger, larger, has more resources, tends to have an advantage in a war like that. Although, as we just mentioned, Russia's not really making many great gains. But wars of attrition, it looks like nothing's happening until one side cracks.
Right.
And the cracking can be political or military. So let's talk about Ukraine before we talk about the Kremlin.
Sure.
The political problems, as we speak here in mid-December, it's not clear if Congress is going to approve more funding by the end of the year. Even if they do, this funding issue is going to keep coming up next year again. The European Union is having an issue with Hungary objecting to a $50 billion aid package. Are these real concerning for you as far as signs of cracking?
Well, to be sure, already, Putin held a sort of annual press conference that he does, a sort of spectacle, and he, of course, was making much reference to all of this. It's become part of the Russian narrative, sort of globally, about a West that's lost patience with Ukraine and is turning around, which I think is a pretty considerable exaggeration, but still, wars are always battles of narratives, and this sort of turbulence, political turbulence, has handed Russia a ready-made narrative. I mean, I think that one can say probably in the next 6 months, the sort of short term, that the aid will probably be delivered in some form. I suspect that the White House will make a deal with Republicans about the southern border in exchange for financial support to Ukraine, and I think in Europe, it may be convoluted, but they'll somehow get there in terms of support. But what one can acknowledge at the present moment, or should acknowledge, is that we've reached a plateau in terms of Western support. And probably we hit that 6 months ago, and it's not going to go up from here. Maybe it won't go down precipitously. I don't think it's going to just end. There are lots of reasons why the West will continue supporting Ukraine, but it has plateaued, and I think the strategic consequences of that are just being worked through. It's not easy for the White House. I think the Europeans are also pretty startled to realize that this is a long war ahead, and the domestic politics are going to get more and more tricky. So I don't think that the strategic side of this has been worked out yet. Every strategy depends on resources. You can't get away from that relationship between strategy and resources. So if the resources are going to go down, the strategy will have to shift, and that's going to be one of the dramas of the coming year.
And the view that Ukraine should negotiate an end to the war is still a minority view in the United States in the halls of power. I can't speak for all commentators, but I think even most Republicans aren't ready to push Ukraine to just surrender 20% of its territory quite yet, despite some of the objections to the aid.
I mean, Trump is, of course, the likely nominee of the Republican Party, and he said that he could resolve the question of Ukraine in 24 hours.
That's not going to happen.
It's not clear what he means by that. If there's something that's not being done that could be done quickly, that would put an end to the war on U.S. terms, or if he's advocating for a negotiated settlement. But that's a high-profile sort of counter strategy to the one that the White House has. But I think you're entirely right. The executive branch is not going to shift until the election, if it goes from Democrats to Republicans next year, and a majority of Republicans, certainly in the Senate, but perhaps in the House as well, and a vast majority of Democrats are sort of on board with Biden's policy, which is not a negotiation policy it's really a policy of containment, or up until a few months ago was a policy of outright winning the war. And I have not seen politicians, even those who are skeptical of the Biden White House or skeptical of the current policy, articulate, including President Trump, I've not seen them articulate a very clear alternative. So there's a kind of restiveness, a discontent with the policy. We see that in the national polling data. Americans are going increasingly skeptical of spending money on Ukraine. That, I think, is an important data point. But a big strategic shift in the kind of rush to end the war, I have not seen that.
It's a very difficult situation for everyone involved. You don't want to pull the rug out from underneath Ukraine, if I could use that cliche, and see them lose the war. But at the same time, there's impatience for how much longer are we going to continue to fight a la World War I, except there are drones involved now, over the same pieces of territory, with neither side able to achieve their military objectives. So let's talk about the Kremlin now. Vladimir Putin did his rather long and boring news conference. Did he say much there that we could really decipher as being important? I mean, it is difficult to understand what he's saying. He lies a lot. He could say something today and then say something different in 2-3 weeks. When I say he lies a lot about the war, I mean, he still doesn't even call it a war. It's a special military operation.
Well, for those who might be looking for a negotiated settlement, I mean, there are figures of speech that you get from Putin that
Yeah.
are sort of everyday.
Figures of speech is a better way maybe putting it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that's sort of how he presents himself, and they're sort of every day for Putin, and sometimes they're, I agree, kind of meaningless or just sort of Putin sounding off. But he did mention that Odessa is a Russian city. That's a city pretty far at the moment from the front lines of the conflict, but it suggests that Putin's ambitions remain pretty substantial when it comes to Ukraine of taking a great deal more territory. So I think you'd have to infer from that that he's not projecting a kind of willingness to negotiate. But I think that we knew that before. There was nothing especially new from the press conference. Obviously, his buoyancy, his optimism is one of the themes that he wishes to strike. I mean, he wishes to intimidate us with that, and at the same time make an appeal to the Russian people
Yeah.
in an election year, whatever that means,
Permanent war
in
footing, it's been
in
called.
Russia. Yes, I think that that's a sort of accurate description. Putin has, over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, tied his presidency to this war. He's reconfigured Russia almost completely, from its culture to its society to its economy, to fight the war. And I think that he was just consolidating all of those efforts in the press conference and suggesting, arguing, contending, proving that it's going to be more of the same for a long time to come. Whether Russians accept that is not a question I would want to rush to answer. I think it's a hard question, but there are no signs of a protest movement or
Yeah, I was wondering
of
how.
cracks in the edifice at the present moment. But I think we all have to be agnostic on those points. I mean, we said that Putin was sort of at home and powerful with the war, and then last June we had a mutiny in the Russian military that did have to come from somewhere. He was able to quell it, to shut it down. He does have his hands on the levers of power. There's no revolution in the waiting, but good to be agnostic about all of that.
You've described this as a black box. It's really hard to tell what's going on inside the Kremlin and whether the war is popular or not, or people are just apathetic and have just accepted this is going to continue in Russia.
I would, I would say, and I agree that the question of evidence is very hard and unsolvable, really. So you end up guessing. But here's my guess: I think that the war is popular. I don't think that every argument the Kremlin makes has been assimilated and would be repeated by Russians, especially questions of denazification and some of the grander cultural civilizational programs. That seems maybe more unique to Putin and a small coterie of advisors, but that Russians don't want to lose the war, that they think that they can pull it out, that they think that a Ukraine in the European Union and in NATO is probably unacceptable to Russia in some basic sense. I think that there's likely consensus on those points, and that's all that Putin really needs. I mean, he doesn't need 100% buy-in in such a non-democratic system. He just needs a basic consensus, and my guess is that's what he has.
Yeah, public opinion is important in autocracies, not the same way as it is in democracies.
Absolutely.
But I want to return to a point I made earlier. I didn't phrase my point very well about in wars of attrition, the side with more resources, more manpower, just geographically larger, has an advantage the longer it goes on. I mean, that's not always true. But I mean, this is a point that another historian that I talked to about the war has made with me. And I'm thinking that maybe Putin agrees with this, that he believes he can win a long war. Historically speaking, this man was born in the 1950s, but he had a brother who was born in 1940, who died in 1942 during the siege of Leningrad. World War II was horrific for the Soviet Union. It lasted a lot longer than this war has lasted to date. This war is almost 2 years old. The Soviet Union fought 4 horrible years of war against the Nazis, losing something like 25 million people. So from his perspective, maybe this is tolerable.
I think it's quite complicated. Depends on the geometry that matters most. If it's a Russia-Ukraine geometry, obviously there's no way that Ukraine can, over the long term, come out on top unless Russia would implode or decide not to wage the war. So that, in a war of attrition, is very, very ominous for Kiev. But on paper, at least, Kiev has behind it a coalition of the world's wealthiest and technologically most sophisticated countries. It's not just all of Europe, the United States, and Canada. It's Japan, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. So, there the geometry doesn't look so good for Russia. Russia's economy is roughly the size of Spain's or Italy's. So, a war of attrition could be very, very punishing for Russia, but it depends, and that's where we return to the question of political will and sort of commitment to Ukraine. Europe has been very receptive to Ukrainian refugees and has done an extraordinary amount, more than the US has done. Europe has done a decent amount, a lot really, to financially support Ukraine, although that may be in question at the moment. Where Europe has been especially slow is with delivering on promises to get armaments to Ukraine. Now, it's not that Germany lacks the money to do that, or France, or Britain, or any of the countries of Europe. It's just that they've been sluggish. And the US has not been sluggish, has provided huge amounts of materiel, but has sort of run out of its stock and seems to be shifting gears and looking elsewhere. Obviously, there's a war in the Middle East that takes quite a bit of U.S. attention, and China hasn't disappeared. So all of this could be quite tricky for the U.S. going forward. It could be tricky for Europe, and then the coalition behind Ukraine is not going to mean what it may mean on paper. So that's really the question. That's the open question. I think Putin feels a degree of self-confidence there, or certainly that's what he says, that the West is going to turn tail. I'm not so sure about that. I think that the stakes of this are pretty high for the West, and if things would start to really deteriorate in Ukraine, that could change the calculus. But it's an open question.
I want to talk about the stakes. We've discussed this in the past. I think they're pretty much the same as they've been. But as the war proceeds or falls into a stalemate, arguably a stalemate, sometimes you reevaluate the stakes. But first, why has the EU, I did mention the aid package that's being held up at the moment by Hungary, but why has the EU, why is Europe, which is a wealthy and prosperous continent that has the wherewithal to provide the weapons, why have they fallen behind?
I don't really know the answers. I suspect that it's still an enormous shock. I mean, the war is only dates back to February 2022, this iteration of the war. And at that point, Europe was completely unprepared for a major military conflict of this kind, not, in any sense ready psychologically or practically, institutionally, for this kind of a conflict. So there's that. There's the generally bureaucratic nature of the European Union, and there is a very, very wide array of threat perception within Europe. And Germany is sort of on the dividing line there. It's quite concerned, and in some ways it takes very seriously the things that Poland and the Baltic states worry about, but it's aloof in some ways. And then countries that are further from the immediate theater of the conflict are in some ways quite aloof, and there's not that sense of urgency. I don't think there's a great urgency in the American population at this point about the war in Ukraine. So these things kind of converge, and the institutions have just moved slowly. And then it's of course a very large coalition. So right. I think money is not maybe the hardest thing to supply, but then to organize different weapon systems and to coordinate and to get that all in gear is very, very hard.
And when it appears the war is simply stuck, Russia may not seem so threatening if it can't even get out of the Donbass after all this time. I've looked at claims that Putin wants to move past Ukraine, if and when he ever conquers it, to other states in Eastern Europe where the Soviet Union used to dominate. I don't know. I don't buy that. Is there any way to, but I can't say for sure, right? This is just my observation as a non-specialist. I mean, two-part question. Do the Eastern European states, like the Baltics, that were annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II, are they afraid of Putin? And do you think they have a good reason to be?
Yes. I mean, my wife is Lithuanian, so I would be remiss if I didn't articulate the concerns in this conversation of Lithuania and the Baltic states and of Poland. I think the idea that Russia would sort of roll over these countries or declare outright war is probably in the background, although it's very much in historical memory, so that, of course, heightens the psychology of fear in this part of Europe. I think that the core concern is that if Ukraine were to fall, the credibility of the United States and the credibility of NATO wouldn't disappear. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance, but it would be in question. Yeah. And so I think the next sequence could be, it's a reasonable thing for these countries to worry about vis-a-vis Russia, how Russia might test that credibility. And I doubt that it would be, Russian soldiers en route to Warsaw or something like that. That, I don't think is a Russian interest.
Capability do they have?
Right. The capability is not there and the Russian interest is not there. But to test, to nibble away at the margins, to sort of create a problem that would be maybe below the threshold for U.S. involvement, but that could imperil the sense of security in these countries. Belarus, for example, with Russia's complicity, has weaponized migrants coming from the Middle East and sent them into Poland and used them to destabilize the border. So internal destabilization, the use of active measures and espionage to create pockets of instability in these places and then to exploit them. I think those are present day concerns, but they would grow
Yes.
if Russia were to be victorious in Ukraine. And it's an open question how the U.S. would respond. My guess is that the U.S. would respond to setbacks in Ukraine by shoring up the NATO alliance, and in that sense, soothing the fears of the Baltics. But for them, it's all a set of hypotheticals, and the fear to me is credible.
Speaking of capabilities, what do you make of the report? This was a declassified report shared with Congress that Russia has lost 315,000 of its pre-war troop total of 360,000. Lost meaning killed, wounded, captured, whatever, just no longer available. And 2,200 of its 3,500 tanks. You look at a statistic like that and you're like, how can Russia continue the war? So what do you make of that?
So I think that this should be put on a larger continuum of data points about Russia at the present moment that are useful, I think, to balance the narrative that the war is ending, that Ukraine is about to lose, that the game is up. And we're very open, as we should be, about the vulnerabilities and the shortcomings of Ukraine. It's good to have an honest and careful conversation about that. Sometimes, though, this conversation, I fear, sort of obscures some of the difficulties that Russia's having. So they've taken roughly 1/5 of Ukrainian territory. They've expended, I think those numbers are plausible. I don't know how to revise them upwards or downwards, but they seem plausible to me. They've expended immense amounts of manpower and material, and they've put the burdens of the war on some of the more vulnerable, marginalized populations in Russia. Now, maybe that's smart politics for Putin, and that allows him to continue the war and to insulate middle-class Russians from some of its effects. But there is a lot of strain, I think, within Russia when it comes to the war. How could there not be, given the scale of it and given the volume of suffering? At the same time that we ask about what our end game is, how does this end? What's our ultimate strategy? And I feel like the answers to those questions are not as good as they should be at the present moment on our side. I think that those questions are pretty punishing on the Russian side as well. So are they going to be in this war for 20 years to take 2/5 of Ukrainian territory? Is it possible for them to make something of the territory that they've conquered? Is it sort of a wasteland? I mean, I have the impression that Mariupol, which is the one major city that Russia has taken since the beginning of the war, I think Mariupol is just like Hiroshima after 1945. It's just completely destroyed. So what's the point of the war on the Russian side?
The Donbass is uninhabitable. I mean, they've conquered a place that's been torn up by war since 2014, the separatist war that Russia backed.
And even Crimea, which is the jewel in the crown for Putin's reputation and the thing that made him so popular in 2014, all this euphoria in Russia about taking back Crimea. Crimea is not a safe place to store naval assets for Russia. It's within striking range, and there have been quite a few strikes in the course of the fall. And it's also not a great place to be. I mean, there are like 2 million people living there. It's a sort of vacation area, if there wouldn't be a war. And that's been lost to Russia. So there are some ways in which the war is just objectively a big setback for Russia. In addition, the kind of break with the West and the break with Europe for a lot of Russians, I think, is traumatic and unnecessary, undesirable. So there's that part of it too. I mean, Putin is riding high in the sense that he's not losing the war. His economy is okay. He's pouring all kinds of money into military production. So he has big plans for the future, and we should take note of those plans. But Russia too, it's sort of a moment in which Russia and Ukraine both, paradoxically, are struggling with the war.
Yes. But neither side believes it's losing, and neither side is ready to throw in the towel, meaning they still believe it's worth it.
Right.
I often bring up the First World War. I've discussed this on my podcast before. Of course, you have to approach this comparison carefully. These are not the same types of wars. But the issue is, after 4 or 5 years of horrible warfare, could the French, just to use them as an example, say it was worth all the lives lost, all the land destroyed to gain back the territory that Germany tried to conquer and did conquer for 4 years during the war, occupied, right? It's a very difficult question to ask. It's a question for Ukrainians, right? Or it was a question for the French. But they expended all those lives. Europe was at its height in 1913. And because no side wanted to give in, right, for real principles, right? The principle of national territory, defensive national territory. That is the principle that France fought for, right? the sanctity of international treaty, you could say. That's why Britain was brought into the war, because Germany then invaded neutral Belgium. I don't need to
Mm,
give you a World War I history
mm.
lesson here. We'll be here all day if I continue to ramble. But you get my point. There are real principles at stake here, but at some point, combatants can reach a point. Is it worth it anymore? I think we're at that point now, but I can't answer that question for Ukrainians.
I mean, I would say two things in response to your very eloquent question, Martin. Uh, and the first, and you did mention my book at the beginning of the conversation. The genre that I found for the book was tragedy. That this war is a tragedy. It's first and foremost a human tragedy for all the people who have been killed and whose lives have been ruptured. And there's really no end in sight to that. And it's truly awful to behold. I mean, we can measure this in terms of soldiers' lives, but they're internally displaced people within Ukraine, which is several million people. They're refugees, again, several million people who have been made refugees by this war. And I think the status of children in Ukraine is its own topic. And even if their families haven't been very directly affected, which is probably rare, their lives have been transformed in ways that are just very, very sad to contemplate. So there's the tragic aspect of this war.
War brutalizes societies.
And I would take that tragedy back as a historical question. And I think we do need to learn from the historical record and try to look at moments when maybe this tragedy could have been avoided. And I think that's a very useful conversation for the United States. I don't know how Russia will have this conversation, if they'll have this conversation, and probably quite a painful question for Ukraine if there were points where they could have avoided this war. I probably would go back to 2012, 2013, and I can see this might be a subject for another of our discussions, Martin, but I can see a lot of things that the United States could have done differently and perhaps would have set us on a different path from the one that we ended up on and, prevented the war, at least opened up a different set of possibilities. So the tragedy elicits that thought in me when I think about this event as a historian. I don't at the present moment, and I agree it's ultimately a question that Ukraine and Ukrainians will have to decide. I don't at the moment feel that on the Ukrainian side the war is futile, unnecessary, sort of in a haze of World War I senselessness for Ukraine. Because I do think the alternative, and again, these are very difficult questions to adjudicate ethically, but the alternative is to live under Russian occupation. And I think we just, in a way, know too much about what that occupation would look like at this point. We do know that when Russia went in February 2022, they had all kinds of blueprints and drafts to create concentration camps in Ukraine. And we know the story of the filtration camps, forced efforts at Russification, abduction of Ukrainian children. I think that anybody who would be connected to the military or the political classes in Ukraine, if they were to lose the war, would have very bleak futures. And so I can understand on the Ukrainian side why there's a desire to sort of preserve the territory that they have at the very least, hold on to statehood, hold on to nationhood, and to do so through military conflict with Russia. But the price is extremely high, and in no sense should we wave the Ukrainian flag over here in comfort and just say go for it and do it for as long as you have to, sort of for our sake or for the sake of international order or for the sake of Europe. But for the sake of Ukrainians, the war, I think, still to me makes a kind of basic sense.
Yeah, the point I should have added is that they don't have a good faith partner on the other side to negotiate.
I don't think so.
No.
We don't know where Russia is. I do hope that the U.S. has as much back-channel contact with Russia as possible. We have the most skilled diplomat in the U.S. government is the director of the CIA, who's a former ambassador to Russia. This is Bill Burns. And I would hope that he's exploring, in whatever formats he needs to, questions of making peace in Ukraine.
There might be a time within Russia where they determine this is no longer worth what we're putting.
Precisely. That happened, as the historians would tell us, a few times during World War I.
That's right.
That there were chances to wind it down sooner. And as historians of the Cold War would tell us, most of all, Mel Leffler, a wonderful emeritus historian at the University of Virginia, wrote a great book about the 3 or 4 moments in the Cold War when we could have ended it, including in 1959, and not long after the death of Stalin, when there was a chance to really put some of those tensions to rest. So by all means, for military, political, and ethical purposes, that should all be explored. But it is my working assumption that Putin still has very vast ambitions for Ukraine, that he thinks he's probably succeeding, that he has the support of the Russian population, that the economy is delivering, and that the military is still, sort of in his service. And so if all of that is true, that doesn't point in the direction of good negotiations and points in the direction of further war.
And we'll wrap up with this on that note. It's my expectation the war will continue. And regardless what happens with the Donbass or any possible negotiated settlement down the line, Russia will continue to have a hostile relationship with the European Union, the United States, the NATO alliance. We talked about, I got to be specific who I'm referring to here. The war means different things in the so-called global South and in China, but we're sitting here in the United States and we're not far from Congress who's debating sending many more billions over to Ukraine. So that's the context here, the West. And your position is that the West needs to contain Russia.
Correct.
Not defeat Russia. Understand that this war might go on for many more years. It may not be hot war, but there may just be like we had in the Donbass prior to 2022, a low-level separatist war there for a while, simmering. So what does that mean, contain Russia?
So I'm a historian, as you know, historian of the Cold War, Martin. Yes. I think I'm sort of trapped in the language and the imagination of the Cold War. So this is the most obvious Cold War idea in terms of the present moment, to contain Russia, George Kennan's great thinking. And I think it means a couple of things. And I think we can end our conversation in this regard on an optimistic note, which is always a nice thing to do. So what Kennan acknowledged in the nuclear age with containment with the Soviet Union is that you're not going to defeat the Soviet Union. It's not a feasible possibility. And you're not going to get unconditional surrender. So you have to live with that. You sort of have to accept it. On the other hand, to do nothing is unwise because, in his judgment, the Soviet Union was expansionist and was moving against certain key allies and assets of the United States. And so it was necessary to contain Soviet power. So he thought of that as a long-term strategy that was possible to resource, that had limits, but also had objectives. And I think all of that is useful to contemplate at the present moment. A very neutral way of looking at the war in Ukraine at the present moment is not the question of who's winning and who's losing, but where the line is going to be. I don't think Russia, even in its sort of wildest fantasies, could take all of Ukraine, or perhaps even wants to take all of Ukraine. So there will be a line there from the Russian side. Ukraine would like all of its territory back. I wish them all success, but it's probably unlikely. And so the line will also be there on the Ukrainian side. I think it's in the interest of the United States that that line be there. And I think containment can kind of work around that line. And I think what the Cold War demonstrates is that over time, you can't get rid of all the tension, but you can find rules of engagement. And if you can find rules of engagement, as sort of occurred in the early 60s with the Cold War, on top of that, you can build certain structures of diplomacy, arms control, a degree of conflict management. By 1975, the Soviet Union, Europe, and the US had found agreement on the borders of Europe, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which was a great diplomatic achievement. So, you can contain, you can find rules of engagement, you can find ways at least of minimizing the effects of some of these awful conflicts, and find ways of managing and learning to live with them. That would be my hope with this. And I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossibly expensive. I think it retains important layers and notions of Ukrainian sovereignty, and I don't think it gets us into World War III with Russia. So those are all the reasons why I would argue for containment.
And Russia will at some point have a new leader. I mean, Vladimir Putin's in his 70s, not going to be around forever, and maybe that person will be more conciliatory or face the reality that this is also a disaster for his or her country, whoever.
Precisely. The most dangerous year of the Cold War, many historians argue, they sort of disagree on this point, but the most dangerous year is 1982. Sort of Andropov in charge in the Soviet Union and a new president in the United States who was trying to change things and, sort of move the dial on the Cold War. In 1985, you have Mikhail Gorbachev who comes to power, and a whole new set of possibilities opens up. I certainly wouldn't make the prediction that Putin will be followed by a kind of Gorbachev-type reformer, but still, from the vantage point of 1982, Gorbachev was totally unthinkable. Everybody was much more pessimistic. So let's keep that in mind as well as we go through our winter of discontent.
Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. Dead. We get Gorbachev. Michael Kimmage, Catholic University historian. Thank you. Your book, Collisions, coming out in March. We thank you for being here. I'm Martin DeCaro at History as It Happens podcast, which is available at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you find your podcasts.